Greetings everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of the Risk 4.0 video blog series. In this particular episode, we aim to explore how we might improve the organizational control of complex disruptive modern risks. Now, for those of you who have been following the series, you'll know that much of what we talk about evolves around how the risk management profession needs to gear up, change its thinking and practices in preparation for our transition into the fourth industrial revolution, Industry 4.0 as it's become known. In the same way that steam, electricity, and computers revolutionized our working world 3 times before, we are now expecting the same to happen again as we see advanced smart technologies, autonomous machines, and advanced data sharing systems combine and revolutionize our working world once again. Now, this presents a particularly interesting problem for the risk management profession. What works today is not necessarily going to work tomorrow. And we need to start thinking about what the risk profession of the future needs to look like. And this is much of what the video blog series is about. So just as a recap, the fourth industrial revolution is expected to have 2 primary characteristics. And we need to understand these characteristics and gear up accordingly. The first one is that we're expecting a world of absolute global connectivity. That is a fully integrated working world of around 8 or 9 billion individuals, all connected via trade, travel, and technology. In other words, this world is going to be systemically complex. The second part is that it's going to be perpetually disruptive. As we see rapidly emerging technologies, shifting consumer behaviors, macro global forces, and mass societal transformation, we're expecting the world to change, just as it changed during the steam revolution, the electricity revolution, or the computer revolution. There's no doubt about that. We are going to experience radical transformational change over the next 2 or 3 decades. So the question that we have to ask as management professionals and as risk professionals is, how do we gear up for this? How do we prepare? How do we get ready? And the simple answer is that we are going to have to start understanding complex systems and their interactions, and we are going to have to start understanding the impacts and emergence of disruptive forces. This is particularly prevalent for the risk management profession. It's something that we are going to have to come to terms with, because disruption goes to the heart of much of what risk does within an organization. So this topic has fascinated me for quite a while, so much so that I actually embarked on a 7-year PhD by research program into this. The good news is that in the recent weeks, my PhD thesis, its findings, and its empirical data have been accepted by the supervisory panel, and my PhD is actually now going to final examination, which is the last step into getting my doctorate. So I'm quite excited about that, but what it means for us is that I can actually start sharing some of the observations that were made in my PhD thesis, and this is what I'm going to talk about mostly today. So right now, I believe that we are facing a bit of a challenge within the risk management profession. Historically, we have been taught to think about risk as being independent, single-dimensional scenarios that can all be controlled by equally autonomous or independent controls, very much risk register style. That's how we've been taught to look at risk. And we've also been taught that regardless of the risk circumstance, the scale, and the nature, a one-size-fits-all control approach is good enough for all circumstances. This particular view is starting to prove problematic in the new profession, and I developed a graph to explain why. So if you can picture 4 quadrants, where on the left-hand axis we have what we might call our inherent versus emergent risk. So your inherent risks are those risks that are well-known, well-defined, and expected. They're obvious. For example, fraud is inherent to banking. Theft is inherent to retail. Safety is inherent to mining and operations and that kind of thing. Emergent risks are those ones that are a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more vague. They may or may not happen. We're not quite sure how they will materialize. So you have inherent risks and you have emergent risks. On the bottom scale, what we have is your discrete versus systemic risks. Your discrete risks are those independent, isolated, localized, one-off type risks, where your systemic risk are those that are connected to multiple factors. So discrete's not connected to anything specifically and can exist by itself. Systemic requires multiple control inputs and is connected to multiple factors. Now, if you can think of those 4 concepts, what we now have is 4 quadrants in which risk can exist. In the first quadrant, where risks are both inherent and discrete, this is where you might have what we can call simple ordered risks. These are your risks that are obvious, they are linear, they are driven by cause and effect. Hazards are a very good example. If we don't put a rail on the stairs, people will trip and fall. Very linear, very cause and effect. If we move up one level to where risks are both emergent and discrete, now we have what we might call connected risks. These are your risks that are an outcome of a series of connected events. Very much like your countdown to disaster, airplane crashes, major industrial failures, that kind of thing. We see a sequence of events being influenced by outside factors, generating an outward outcome. But the fact is, you can see that auditable trail. You can see how one thing led to another. Connectivity, but still linear. Moving into the third quadrant, we now start getting into what we might call our complicated risks. These are risks that are both systemic and inherent, connected to multiple factors, although still a little bit obvious and known. A good example would be something like a financial and economic market. All the contributing components of an economic market are all connected to each other: the buyers, the sellers, the commodities, the prices. If you change one or you shift one, everything else reacts and adjusts accordingly. So this is your first of your systemically connected risks, all connected to each other. They shift accordingly when things change. In the top right quadrant, we now start getting to a new, unique brand of risk. This is where your risks are both emergent and systemic. And in this quadrant, we find risk can actually transition through different orders. They can go from complex to chaotic. Here, the risks are incredibly energized, evolutionary. They exist in multiple scales, highly connected, different magnitudes, continually shifting, continually transitioning. A very good example of this complex disruptive type of risk would be something like the war in Palestine. On a good day, it's complex. On a bad day, it's chaotic, and it shifts in between depending on the circumstances that are happening there. It is a specific class of risk. Some people refer to them as wicked problems. Some people call them wicked threats. But this is where your unknown unknowns exist, your black swans and various other highly uncertain events that tend to exist. For our purposes, we're going to call the risks that exist in this quadrant as being complex disruptive risk. And we're going to talk more about that through this course. So I think the fundamental learning that we've got from this quadrant, if you go through it, is that as you go through quadrant 1 to 4, from simple all the way up to chaotic, we see two things happening. We see complexity, uncertainty, and dynamism increasing quite exponentially towards the tail end. And we also see consistency, predictability, and stability reducing. So this opens quite an interesting question. How do we control risks at the upper ends of the quadrants where they are highly unstable, highly uncertain, highly unpredictable? And this is a big industry question right now, so a big academic question right now. It's part of what my PhD looked at. And it's not just me, there are quite a few people looking at this, but I looked at it from a particular angle. And this is what I want to share with you. One of the key things we're experiencing right now, this is so what of this, or why are we doing this, why this is important, why should anybody care about this? One of the challenges we're meeting right now is many of our world's macro global threats are actually trending towards that upper right corner. They're not simple, they're not rational, they're not standardized risks. These are complex, disruptive, wicked risks, and they're all trending up towards that complex, chaotic. So the fundamental learning here is that top right quadrant is actually the domain of complex disruptive phenomena, aka wicked problems. And this is something that organizational risk management and the risk profession needs to come to understand. What happens in these upper quadrants is very different to what happens in the lower quadrant, and therefore requires different thinking, different strategies, and different controls. So what is a complex disruptive risk? Before we proceed, maybe we need to go in a little bit more detail of what we're specifically talking about. These type of risks are ones that are highly energized and connected with multiple moving parts. In other words, they're complex. They're systemically integrated. They behave in an irrational manner. In other words, are often unpredictable, even potentially chaotic. They have a fundamental resistance to resolution. So they are evolutionary. As you put one control in, everything shifts and they just move into a new type of problem. And lastly, they have no stopping rule. There is no natural momentum for them to burn out. So they can be perpetual. They can just go on and on in different shapes and different formats, picking up momentum and dropping off momentum. Now, at this stage, you may be saying, this is great, but this sounds very theoretical. Well, not so much. Let's consider some of the risks that we're facing right now in our modern working world. The coronavirus pandemic, right? It's a classic wicked risk or complex disruptive risk. Just consider what it did to our world over the last 2.5 years. Here we are almost 3 years later, and we still haven't found a resolution. It still hasn't died out, and it's no less complex or impactful as it was at the beginning. Increasing climate disruption. This is not getting any lower. It's getting worse and worse. Vulnerable economic markets, increasing debt, instability in the developing world. This is a major problem right now, and it's impacting us, all of us financially in one way or another. Hyperinflation is what we're experiencing right now, primarily because of this. We're experiencing increasing societal fragmentation, rising geopolitical tension. It's all happening right now. And then, of course, there's the fourth industrial revolution. We still haven't worked out how we're going to transition effectively or safely into a future world run by autonomous intelligent machine. And it's all of these are macro global forces impacting us right now. They're all global disruptive risks. They're affecting governments, organizations, and people on a personal level. And it's these kind of risks that we now need to start thinking about in terms of how do we control our exposure to these risks. So I think the new reality we need to start facing is that many of our modern macro organizational risks either materialize within or trend towards the upper right quadrant. So this is the quadrant that many organizations and the risk management profession needs to start learning how to play it. Because as we transition into the fourth industrial revolution, these kind of risks are going to become more and more prevalent, and they're probably going to become the business as usual type of risk that we need to learn to order. And unfortunately, many of our existing risk management practices, our standardized risk control solutions, simply cannot cut it at this level. So the question then becomes, well, what should our solutions to the modern risk management problem be? So just as a very simple exercise that you can all do in your own time, go take your organizational risk register, your big strategic risks, your big material risks, and map them out on this quadrant. It doesn't have to be too scientific. Just give a basic continuum of 0 to 10, rate them, and put them in the quadrant that best describes those risks. And I think what you will find is you will see a bit of a scatter plot all over this quadrant, where risks are actually spread quite evenly between the lower bottom and the top right. And what this actually shows us is that there are multiple scales to the type of risk that you are facing. So if we actually start categorizing these, what we'll learn is that if the majority of the risks that you put in your scatter plot are sitting in the bottom left-hand corner, then this is the domain of your standardized risk management. So if most of your risks are sitting down there, well, that's fine. Your standardized risk solutions like risk registers, audit plans, your compliance frameworks, all those standardized risks is good enough. And there are a lot of organizations like that. So I'm not being derogatory. I mean, factories, production lines, transactional services, retail, they all live in a high level of consistency. So most of their risks do sit in that bottom left-hand corner. So they can adopt standardized risk practices. But once you start moving into sort of multi-dimensional organizations, then what you might find is that quite a few of the risks actually sit in that middle band. And that middle band is probably the domain of things like data analytics, scenario analysis, and probabilistic modeling, your quantitative risk assessments and that kind of thing. So if you're an organization or a major program or a project or whatever it is, and you find that the majority of your risks are sitting in that middle band on the threshold, they could go either way, then probably you need to be quite reliant on not just standardized risk management, but also data analytics, scenario analysis, and probabilistic modeling, all right? But as you start moving towards the top, we now start moving into that special category where risks start coming alive. They start becoming energized. And this is actually the world of natural systemic resilience and complex systems thinking. When we get to this level, risks are highly integrated, highly evolutionary, highly connected to multiple contributing factors. We are now so far away from standardized risk management. Risk registers, audit plans, compliance, they can't deal with the kind of risks that are sitting on this top right-hand side. Just standardized solutions cannot fit complex problems, right? So what we now need to start understanding when we get to risks that at this level, particularly if you're an organization where most of your risks or many of your material risks are sitting in this top right quadrant, now we need to start thinking about how we build in a natural systemic resilience to all types of risks and how we can use complex systems thinking to manage the connectivity of these risks. So natural systemic resilience, most people have heard about this. Unfortunately, in the risk management profession, when we talk about risk resilience, people automatically think about business continuity planning or disaster recovery planning. That is a type of resilience, but it's a very limited type of resilience. When I talk about natural systemic resilience, I'm talking about the natural systems view of resilience. And basically, their definition is that resilience is the ability of a natural system to intelligently prepare for and respond to environmental changes. And there are 4 dimensions to resilience. There is awareness, the ability to foresee emerging changes, readiness, the ability to prepare for those changes, responsiveness, the ability to react to those changes, and agility, the ability to change when change is required. So when we talk about resilience, we're talking about these four dimensions, getting organizations to actively become more aware, more ready, more responsive, and more agile in the face of complex disruptive threats. Now, at this stage, you must say, well, that's great, but how do you actually do that? I intend to talk on that topic in more detail in future episodes, but just as an executive summary to show you some of the things that modern organizations can and should be doing to build in a natural systemic resilience. Well, the first one I think is quite obvious, building in and embedding a genuine organizational resilience framework. There's a lot of work being done in this space, but actually building in a capability and a capacity within an organization that improves their awareness, their readiness, their reactivity, and the adaptation to risk, and building formal KPIs and making it an actual structured event to improve the capability and character of the organization in terms of resilience. On the back of this, another exercise you could do, very similar to what we spoke about earlier, is you could start developing resilient and contextually relevant control strategies for high materiality risk. So those risks sitting up in the top right quadrants that we spoke about, now we need to start looking at how we approach them with resilience in mind. Not risk registers, not audit plans. That is part of it, but we need to go beyond it. We also now need to think, how do we improve our awareness, readiness, responsiveness, and adaptation to these risks, and have plans for that. Other things you could do, resilience and vulnerability metrics and diagnostics. This is starting to gain a bit of traction. A lot of organizations are taking these on board. They're building tailored or buying into other metrics that already exist, diagnostics, and they're doing their own diagnostics and regularly testing their own resilience and vulnerability and reporting on that as part of their ongoing risk management. And then lastly, once you understand what your resilient metrics and vulnerabilities are, you're probably in a position to actually start developing performance dashboards that you can track regularly and report the progress on. Now, this is some of just the obvious stuff. There's a lot more you could be doing, but this is the obvious resilience enablers within organizational resilience. The next one I want to talk about is complex systems thinking. So how do we bring complex systems thinking into risk management? And this is a large part of what my PhD actually researched. How do we use pure academic theory to bring in practical methods and practices into the way we manage complex disruptive forces? So as an example, have a look at this heat map that we've got here. So the conventional view of risk teaches us to look at risks in terms of impact and likelihood, and then prioritize them based on the heat map. I know heat maps have got a bad rap in recent years. I still see some value in them, particularly around communication across broad stakeholder groups. But in terms of transforming from conventional views to a complex systems view, imagine if we didn't look at these risks in terms of likelihood and impact, but we looked at them in terms of connectivity and dependency. The reality is that most material or macro organizational risks are actually interconnected and codependent. They have relationships, and many of those relationships actually determine the priority or the prevalence of the risk. We have never been taught to start looking at risks in terms of being an ecosystem, of contributing a codependent factor. As soon as we start looking at risk as being an ecosystem of stuff, we're now in a position to manage the whole ecosystem as opposed to individual parts. And as we've all learned over the years, the whole of a system is often so much more material and momentous than just the individual contributing parts. So instead of addressing risks line by line in a risk register, address it as a full ecosystem. You will get more momentum and more traction that way. There's a lot of thinking behind this and how that may be done. And two examples that I will share with you. It looks something like this. So the first method for putting complex systems thinking into a modern organization's risk efforts is developing and nurturing critical control ecosystems for both the organization and its high materiality risks. So the idea is to do some research into what are the control requirements, the control factors, the control dependencies, and relation to dependencies for all your high materiality risks, or even the organization as a whole. And then actually map out those controls in terms of an ecosystem. What does it look like? So this particular ecosystem that you see in front of you is the one that I developed as part of my PhD thesis. We looked at a very particular type of risk in a very specific circumstance. So I'm not going to claim that this suits all. This is just one example of a control ecosystem. What we did is we identified all the dependencies and control factors around a number of high materiality risks in a complex program environment, and we built a control ecosystem that we could actually nurture and monitor and would tell us where we're strong and where we're vulnerable. And that's the kind of thinking we need to start bringing into our control frameworks for high materiality risks. Another example is mapping out material risk ecosystems for improving the control. So once we understand what our risks are, start mapping the relationship between them and start understanding the connectivity between them. And as I said, control it as a collaborative ecosystem rather than individual line items on a risk register. Now, this kind of thinking's been around for a while. For those of you who follow the World Economic Forum global risk reports that come out every year, they've been mapping out our global macro risks in this fashion for probably about 7 or 8 years right now. And it gives you a much better visual of your risk exposure when you can see all the risks mapped out in some form of a connected relationship map than just sitting on a risk register. Because risk registers seem to tell us that all these risks can be managed by themselves, whereas an ecosystem shows you why that is not true. An ecosystem shows you that they all have to be managed as a whole. Because in the end, the whole ecosystem is often so much more momentous than the sum of the individual constituent parts. And we in the risk profession need to start understanding that better and applying that thinking to how we control risks and to our control frameworks. So I think the key learning that we have from all of this, if there's only one thing that you take away from this particular presentation, it's that as risks trend towards that top right-hand side of this quadrant that I've shown you, they leave standardized risk thinking and practices behind, and they move into a new realm, a realm of complex disruptive risks, which cannot be managed by conventional standardized risk methods. They can only be managed through things like natural systemic resilience and complex systems approaches. And this is the next evolution of our risk profession. We've mastered, or at least we should have mastered, the standard risk management methods. We are currently in the process of mastering data analytics, scenario analysis, and probabilistic modeling. But the next level that organizations need to start taking on board is building in natural systemic resilience so they can weather all types of risk, regardless of their probability, a natural immunity, if you will, and complex systems thinking. When we start looking at our material risk and the controls they are dependent on as a connected, collaborative ecosystem and start nurturing that ecosystem to actually give you a total whole result rather than individual line by line results. So folks, I think what we need to start understanding, if we haven't already, is that this concept of disruption is real. All right? Take a look at all those brand names on the page in front of you. Every one of these was a major market leader, if not the market leader, in our collective lifetimes. All of them have since been disrupted, some of them rapidly so. And when the world's leading brands can be disrupted, then all the other organizations out there need to start operating with a heightened sense of awareness. So disruption is real. Complex disruptive risk is the new generation of risks that are going to be coming along as we progress into the fourth industrial revolution. And we in the risk management profession need to start understanding how to control those risks much better than we are already. So just in terms of future episodes, I think the next one that I'm going to do is going to be a little bit more detail on the natural systemic resilience. There's quite a lot in there to unpack and we could talk about. So I think I'll go into more detail in the next episode on that one. And then the episode after that, I think what I'll do is I'll go into more on the complex systems thinking one. We'll do dedicated episodes to each. So I hope you enjoyed this particular episode. I hope it was useful and I hope it gives you something to think about. Until next time, thank you for your time and keep safe.